Hey, Coach Orange here, going over Chapter 5. This is our review for our test. All right, so we're going to start right off. This is all about absolutism and absolute monarchs in Europe. Keep in mind that absolute monarchs generally wanted to get power away from the nobles. Think of the nobles as the regional power and the monarchs as the national power. And that's what they wanted to do. They also wanted to get power away from some of the representative bodies. Another concept that goes along with absolute monarchy is divine right. Most of these monarchs believe that they were absolute because God put them there, and so that's called divine right. By God, they were there. One of the wars that will be on your test is the 30 Years' War. This 30 Years' War was a religious war in the early 1600s. It was started in Bohemia, which was part of the Habsburg land, and some Protestants in Bohemia had a revolt against the Habsburgs there. The war spread to all over Europe. The first half of the 30 Years' War, it was won by the Habsburgs. They gained a lot of ground as the Catholic force and in the Holy Roman Empire. The Swedish army came in midway through, and the French, even though they were Catholic, the French came in on the side of the Protestants and eventually pushed back the Habsburgs, and the Habsburgs lost. So the result of the 30 Years' War was a defeat of the Habsburgs, lessened their power. The French increased their power, and the Swedish increased their power. Okay. One of the other benefits the Swedes had was their army. When they came into the area of the Holy Roman Empire, they had a professional army. They didn't have mercenaries or conscripts. They had a professional army. Some other things about the results of the 30 Years' War. It was at the end of the 30 Years' War, when they had the Peace of Westphalia, that the concept of having a peace treaty at the end of the war was kind of a modern concept with the peace treaty. The other thing was the development of the modern state in Europe. Another war we will talk about briefly is the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1713. This was a war in Europe that wanted to prevent the French throne and the Spanish throne to join into one large empire under a single monarch. Okay, that happened when Charles I of Spain, the Habsburg king, died with no heir, and the European powers wanted to stop a combined French-Spanish empire. Now, the most Catholic king in Spain was Philip II. He was the most Catholic king all over Europe. He fought the Muslims of the Ottoman Empire. Philip II fought the Protestants in Central Europe, and he was the defender of the faith. Philip, again, was an absolute monarch. Now, early in his rule and before his rule started, Spain made a lot of money from gold and silver that came over from the Americas to Spain. So initially, the gold and silver made them very wealthy. But Spain failed to develop a middle class, and eventually inflation caught up with them, and they were low on money. Philip had to declare bankruptcy, actually 3 times. He had to borrow money, so he had to raise taxes. So Spain ended up with a pretty bad financial situation. Bad money problems in Spain, high inflation, high taxes. Philip did have a really cool palace called Escorial, and it's still there today as a modern tourist site, a big, beautiful castle-type palace. Philip's biggest defeat was his navy. He wanted to invade England for many reasons, which we've already gone over, but he was defeated. His Spanish Armada was defeated by the British, and that was in 1588 in the English Channel. But the thing that we need to remember with the defeat of the Spanish Armada is that the Armada was wiped out by storms. 10 times as many ships were sunk by storms. Philip also had to deal with the revolt of the Netherlands. The French people revolted there, and created a republic. This was the United Provinces of the Netherlands. They created a government which had elected governors, and really the governors were elected, but they were pretty much under control of the wealthy merchants and landowners. The Dutch became the bankers of Europe. Another quick note on something on Spain was the book Don Quixote was written by Cervantes. Now in Central Europe, where the Austrian Habsburg ruled a lot, throughout Central Europe, the serfs stayed on the farms. They did not move to the cities. So no middle class developed in Central Europe, and they had weak national governments or weak states. Charles V was the Habsburg, Austrian, and he wanted to make sure that his daughter inherited all of his land. He had no sons. So he had, before he died, he had all the kings and princes throughout Europe to sign a document called the Pragmatic Sanction that said that she could inherit the land. And after he died, Maria had to fight a war. Maria Theresa had to fight a war because Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded Silesia. Now, Frederick the Great of Prussia was known as a father to his people. He wanted to be a father to his people. He invaded Silesia because Maria Theresa was a woman and she was weak, according to him. And that was called the War of Austrian Succession. Prussia seized Silesia and won the war, and they kept Silesia, and Prussia became a powerful nation. But Maria did not like that. She waited a few years and then started a war again, which we call the 7 Years' War. And during the 7 Years' War, there was a lot of fighting between all the countries in Europe. It was Austria against Prussia. Prussia kept Silesia, so the result in Europe of the 7 Years' War was that there were no territorial changes in Europe. France had its own problem with religious wars. 1562 to 1598, they fought 8 different religious wars. They had 4 very weak kings, and the nobles, many of the nobles were Protestants. The Protestants in France were called Huguenots. To solve the religious problem, Henry IV, Henry of Navarre, was to become the king. He did become the king. He was from the Bourbon family, and he had a way to settle the religious problems. He converted to Catholicism because he was a Protestant, but he also signed the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes said that there would be religious toleration in France. So that's how he settled the religious conflict in France. After he died, there was a very weak king called King Louis XIII. King Louis XIII had a minister named Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu extended the power of the monarchy and tried to limit the power of the nobles, and Cardinal Richelieu expanded the power of the Catholic Church. Now, after Louis XIII died, Louis XIV became king, and just like his father, Louis XIV was too young to rule when he became king, so he had a minister, Cardinal Mazarin. Mazarin extended the same type of procedures that Richelieu had. Cardinal Mazarin extended the power of the monarchy at the expense of the nobility, and he tried to limit Huguenot, the things the Huguenots were doing. He persecuted them. King Louis XIV, his nickname was the Sun King. He had a famous saying. He said, "I am the state," linking himself as an absolute ruler to the federal government of France. "I am the state," Louis said. Louis built a beautiful palace called Versailles, and at Versailles, Versailles was built to show his power. Under the philosophies of mercantilism, King Louis XIV's finance minister, named Jean-Baptiste Colbert, made a lot of money for France, tried to make it a self-supportive state to win the mercantilist game. King Louis XIV also had government officials called intendants. Those are the ones who were designed to collect taxes and do the governmental work, rather than have the nobles do it. So that's one of the ways that King Louis XIV got power away from the nobles. In France, or excuse me, in Russia, in 1462, there was a Russian ruler there named Ivan the Terrible, and he won wars against the Mongols to set up a Russian state. He was so terrible that he killed his own son. He was very terrible. He had a secret police that went around to kill people that he thought was against his rule. That called the boyars were what they called the nobility class, and he thought the nobility had secretly killed his wife. So Ivan the Terrible was a terrible guy, especially later on in life. He wanted to decrease the power of the boyars. Next, Peter the Great was a Romanov czar of Russia. He was a very absolute monarch, a very good monarch for his people. There's a lot of things he had to do. He had to westernize Russia because Russia was a very backward country. Russia was so backward, they were 100 or more years behind the rest of Europe. They didn't have roads, they didn't have a banking system. They were all in feudalism and serfdom. So Peter wanted to get them out of that. Peter traveled to Western Europe in order to get some ideas. He wanted to westernize Russia and make it more modern. First thing he wanted to do was build a new capital on the Baltic Sea. He called it St. Petersburg. About 10,000 serfs died building that. But this is something that Peter needed for purposes of trade because Russia had no port. And Peter built the port, named it after his patron saint, St. Peter. And from that point on, Russia has always wanted a warm water port. Even to this day, Russia wants a better warm water port. Peter also brought potatoes to Russia to feed people more. He increased really the rights of women. Women weren't as repressed. He brought Western clothes and styles and culture to Russia. Now, moving on to England. England at this time had absolute monarchs, and we'll talk here about the transition of England from absolute monarch to civil war to restoration and glorious revolution. James I was absolute monarch who came after Queen Elizabeth. He got in 1603. He was an absolute monarch. He came in from Scotland, and he was absolute monarch. His son Charles I was also an absolute monarch. They were both Protestants, which was good. But Charles I needed money, so he went to Parliament and asked him for money. Parliament said, "Sure, we'll give you some money, but you're going to have to sign a petition of right," and that limited the power of the monarchy. Charles signed it, limiting his power, but then he didn't abide by it. So there was a war there called the English Civil War. The Parliament was run mostly by Puritans, so they got up an army and they fought against the king. Well, the Puritans' Parliament won the war. They won the English Civil War. Their leader was Oliver Cromwell. He was a military dictator after it was all over, and Oliver Cromwell won the war with Puritans in Parliament, and then they put King Charles I on trial and executed him for being a bad person. Now, after Oliver Cromwell died, the people in England, the nobles that is, they decided that they really wanted a king back, so they did something called the Restoration. They went and got Charles II, who was hanging out someplace up in Scotland. They said, "Hey, come on down here and be our king." He said, "Sure." We call that the Restoration. Charles II restored the monarchy. He was forced to sign a habeas corpus law that said that the king couldn't just put somebody in jail for no reason at all. After that, there was a king, James II. Problem there, he was Catholic. The nobles wanted to wait him out, but then he had a male son, so they said, "We're not going to have any Catholic kings in England. We've done that before, so we're going to have to go find us a king." So the nobles went to find a king. They went across the English Channel. They went over to the Netherlands, and they found a king named William, and his wife was Mary. And so they asked William and Mary to come and be their king and queen. And that's called the Glorious Revolution. It was a glorious revolution because it was a bloodless revolution. There was no actual fighting. And they were Protestants, so that worked out just fine. They instituted the constitutional monarchy. This has continued up until these days. England has a constitutional monarchy. William and Mary were forced to sign the English Bill of Rights, which limited even more the power of the monarchy. All right, that wraps up everything here. Thank you.